Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kamila Shamsie, and I'm going to be chairing this event this evening or afternoon or night, depending on which part of the world you're in. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Emily. Hay Festival, as many of you know, is a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. And we just want to say thank you to everyone for their continued support and engagement. We're here to talk about the Odyssey, translated by Emily Wilson, written by Homer, which is a contentious issue, but anyway, we can say translated by Emily Wilson because we're very clear on that. And we're here to talk about it because it's the Hay Festival Book Club pick for August. For those who don't already have it, or for those who think it's time to buy that extra copy for someone in your life who needs it, copies are available for purchase on the Hay Festival website, or you can buy a copy, of course, from your local bookseller. Hay Festival Book Club is supported by Unwin Charitable Trust, and you can find past events available to watch free online now. The book club's September selection will be Anansi's Gold by Yepoka Yibu. And now to introduce the main event. Emily Wilson is Department Chair and Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been named a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome in Renaissance and Early Modern Scholarship, a MacArthur Fellow, and a Guggenheim Fellow. Her educational background in both classics and literature have allowed her to translate Homer with a deep understanding of the nuance and music of both ancient Greek and contemporary English. Perhaps this is one of the reasons her translations of both the Odyssey and the Iliad lit such a fire among those of us returning to those ancient texts, and also those coming to them for the first time. Her Odyssey arrives in our lives from a faraway place, but it comes right up to us and reminds us of the power of storytelling, the heartbreak of exile, and the complications of family, all the while entertaining us gloriously with its gods and monsters and godlike, often monstrous humans. I'm delighted to be in conversation with her. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to talk to you.
Emily, I'm going to get on to translation stuff, but you're also, of course, a great reader of the Odyssey, and there's a wonderful introduction where you talk about the text as an impassioned reader. So I have something to ask about that. It's possible there's no classical well-known text about which there's such a misconception around the basic question of what is this about, as there is with the Odyssey. And I think if you were to ask people, what's the Odyssey about? They'd say, most people would say, including some who have read it, oh, it's about a journey of a man and the trials and tribulations he endures. And I should say that every time I return to the complete text after a long absence, I am surprised by how short or how limited a part of the entirety of the Odyssey is that story. And I'm not sure why that misconception particularly exists. You might have some views on that. But really my main question to you is, if it's not a story about a man on this great voyage, what is it a story about?
Yes, that's a great question, a great way of setting it up. I think the misconception is a modern rather than an ancient one. When Aristotle in the Poetics retells the story of the Odyssey, he very much focuses on the second half of the poem, the part that modern readers tend to skip over. I think part of it is the extraction of the wandering books, which are, a quarter of the poem, as the kid's story. When I first encountered this story as a child, it was through kids' retellings and a kids' play version of it, which was very much just focused on Odysseus's wanderings around encountering all these strange people, monsters, goddesses, and all that. It's a story, the original poem is about nostos. And it's nostos, which is the word from which we get nostalgia, meaning a homecoming journey. But it's a very sophisticated account of what does it mean to come home, such that the first four books aren't focused on Odysseus himself. They're focused on his son and his household in his absence. So in order to get the story of what does it mean for Odysseus to come home, we first have to establish what does it mean for him to be away. We then also have to establish what might it mean for him to try out different homes, as he does in the Wandering books. And then in the whole of the second half of the poem, the process of coming home is shown to be not just geographical, because it's not just, he comes home geographically halfway through the poem, he's back in Ithaca, and yet Nostos is not achieved, because homecoming is also about rebuilding or recreating multiple different relationships and rediscovering multiple different identities. So he's not home until he's both been home to his swineherd, been home to his son, been home to his wife, and all of those are different homecomings.
And I suppose as you're saying that, I'm thinking, because the beginning, we do focus on his son quite a lot. And I suppose there's a way you could say neither Penelope or Telemachus are really, their home is not really home, because these suitors have invaded it. And so there's that sense of, and this may be a sort of contemporary take on home, but that feeling of, well, actually for them, it's not a home properly either. And Telemachus has to find a home within it, possibly.
Right. I mean, I think the poem also raises that central question, even in the first few lines of the poem, about whether anyone except Odysseus is going to get a homecoming in this poem. I mean, of course, most of the characters who are introduced in those first few lines are going to end up dead, so they don't get a homecoming in a very literal way. But there's also real questions about, does Penelope get a homecoming? She gets to have her husband come home, but does that mean she's more at home? And does that mean Telemachus, who's on this journey towards growing up as a man, his father coming home in some sense enables that journey, but also in some sense blocks it, because he can't be the adult in the prime of life if his father is home being that role. So I think it's complex about that, about who gets to come home and whether Odysseus' homecoming enables other people to be home.
Yeah, so it's much less it's not really the action adventure we might think it is from the children's books.
Yes, it has some element of that, but that's certainly not the whole thing. I mean, in fact, when I was discussing with the publishers what to put on the cover of my Odyssey translation, I said, whatever we have to not have a ship, because almost every translation of the Odyssey has a ship, and it's enabling that misconception that it's all about sailing all over the place. And that's a very small part of the poem.
You mentioned sort of you reading it as a child and the adventure part of it, and my first encounter was the same, just those stories. And I remember the illustrations of Odysseus and the Cyclops. But I wondered if you could talk a little about your history with the Odyssey. I mean, you were a reader of it, and I think you acted in it possibly far longer.
Yes. Yes, so I was Athena in the school play when I was 8, which was a very fun experience and fun to. I mean, I was a shy, bookish kind of kid, and it's exciting to get to play the goddess who's manipulating the action and get to. The headmaster in the school was the Cyclops, and we got to gouge out his eye, and that was very exciting and fun. And it was fun just to read the kids retelling stories based on the Odyssey. And it was only later, once I was in high school, that I started learning Greek and reading little bits of it in Greek and sort of realizing how much more layered and complex it is, and also how beautiful the language is.
Is there sort of a clear through line for you from encountering the Odyssey and acting in it when you were 8 and then doing the classics later, or is it?
I mean, I don't think my whole life was predetermined at that stage. I think I probably had to make some choices along the way, but maybe. I don't know. Yes.
And then how did you come to be its translator, I suppose? How and why?
And again, I don't see as predetermined. I mean, I was interested in literature and language. I read classics at Oxford. I then did another degree in English literature. I did a PhD. I wrote various things about classical literature and its later receptions, and I thought maybe I'll just spend my whole career doing that kind of thing, writing that kind of book about ancient epic, ancient tragedy, and what happened in later literature, responding to those texts and those cultures. But I didn't think I'm going to be a translator when I grow up. And it was only when an editor at Oxford approached me to consider doing some translations of Seneca's tragedies that I tried it out and realized this is very fun, and it allows me not just to be a literary critic but also a writer. That fusion of skills is fascinating.
And did someone specifically suggest the Odyssey to you, or did you think, oh, actually, this is one I'd like to have a go at?
Someone specifically suggested the Odyssey as well. I was working with Norton on the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and they were looking around for somebody to do a new translation of the Odyssey. And I mean, at first they were seeing if somebody who was actually famous would do it for them, and that didn't work. So then they asked me, and I wasn't sure if I was going to do it at first, because I thought, there are quite a lot of translations already out there. And so I then just reflected on my experiences as a teacher, teaching American undergraduates the Odyssey and other ancient texts in translation. And I just tried to think through what has been difficult in the classroom to get across to the students about this great poem, and are there things that I might do differently in either specific or general ways with the Greek from what's already been done. And I did some close comparison of, in fact, the Cyclops episode I read 12 different translations next to the Greek and sort of thought about what would I do differently here. And after doing that, I realized I have a lot of ideas about what I would do differently. And especially for the fact that both in the UK and the US, most general readers read either a free verse or a prose translation. That seemed to me missing so much about the whole experience of this metrical, musical, oral tradition-y kind of poem. I wanted to use regular meter. I also wanted to really think through the way the poem has multiple different voices, multiple different perspectives. It's proto-dramatic. I thought there were ways that many translators seem to make it sort of seem as if it's always we're looking through the perspective of Odysseus, even though I think the actual poem is very often shifting around, and we're seeing both the perspective of Odysseus and these various other characters.
Let's talk a little about the choices made in terms of meter. So the original is dactylic hexameter. You wrote an iambic pentameter. For those people who are sitting there, oh God, which one? I mean, what that's really necessary for the audience to remind themselves of is dactylic hexameter. Let me put it this way. It's a longer line, right?
It's a longer line, exactly. So, andra moi enepe musa polutropon hosma la polla. So a dactyl is a finger, so it's la, la, la. It's a finger has 3 joints if you're lucky enough to have a whole finger. So it has that, whereas the iamb is a two beat la, la. The dactyl can be 3 syllables, and it's 6 of them as opposed to 5 in a pentameter. So it's a shorter line. And I played around with, could I do a hexameter in English? And I just felt that I couldn't in a way that would make it sound natural and as if it had some forward momentum as the original does. And just the sort of signaling or semantics of what does this form connote would be very different, because dactylic hexameter in an archaic Greek context connotes natural, traditional, poetic form, whereas hexameter in English connotes this is weird. And that's a very different kind of meaning and a very different kind of experience. So I wanted to use what I felt was the only possible form that would connote sort of natural, traditional poetics.
Well, one of the things that makes it so striking that you chose essentially a shorter line is you also decided that you would keep the same line length as in the original.
Same number of lines, yes.
Same number of lines.
Yes.
So the same number of lines, but fewer syllables per line.
Yes, yes.
Not making it easy for yourself.
I made it very hard for myself. And in fact, I decided not to do that with the Iliad because it proved impossible. It was very difficult for the Odyssey, and it was totally impossible for the Iliad. I let myself have more lines. I felt that it was very difficult, but actually was possible for the Odyssey, because quite a lot of Homeric poetics depends on very long cognate words, such as polumekanos, which is a common epithet of Odysseus, meaning super crafty. And I can just translate that as crafty, and then it's 2 syllables for a 5-syllable Greek word. The math can work out as long as there are enough choices where that can work. Whereas with the Iliad, there are so many more names, and you can't make a name have fewer syllables than it has. So I thought it was impossible to do that with the Iliad. Yes, but I wanted to do that because I wanted to value pace. And this is another thing that I felt was the problem with some of the translations that I'd read or taught with, was that many of them seemed too padded to me, such that my students would very often show up for class and say, oh, it was so boring, I could barely get through the reading. And I would be astonished, because Homer is nothing if not fascinating all the time. It's never boring. And yet I could also see why they were bored by some of the translations. It's partly because they would very often have twice as many words as the original does.
I mean, your version, it's so sort of nimble and light, and it moves so quickly. I mean, and at the same time, there's such wonderful music to it. I had a question about working within very constrained forms. I mean, it's been a very long time since I had to write any poetry, but when I did, I found that I enjoyed it the most when I was working with forms that, were the most stringent. So a villanelle or a sestina or
Yes.
ghazal, where there are these very demanding rules that you have to stick by. And when I'm working on a novel, actually, in some way, I start to feel easiest once I have all the rules in place
Yes.
of what the world is, what the narrative perspective is, what the voice is, and sort of everything else is excluded. And then once you're in this edifice, you can sort of
Mm-hmm.
start to move around it. And I wondered whether there was anything of that feeling of, even though it must have been incredibly difficult, um, that actually that difficulty became, I'm not going to say a liberation, because clearly not a
It can
liberation.
be a joy. Yes.
Yeah.
I love the sense of working within constraints, because then you can also have discoveries that feel it's not that anything goes. There are very limited options. And then once you realize, even within my very limited options, I can do this, it can be very
Mhm.
exciting. And
Mhm.
you can have far more in the way of sort of aha moments when you realize within these constraints, I can make this work and I can make it feel light and easy, even though I've been wrestling with this same line for the last 2 weeks and it feels impossible. And then I can have a breakthrough. And it's very exciting.
I wonder if there's one aha moment you could give us.
I don't know if I know. When I said that, I was
Oh,
like, oh no, I've
all
set
right.
myself up for this.
Yes, you did set
But in
yourself
fact,
up.
one of the most cited, like everybody went on and on about my use of complicated for polutropos in the first line of the Odyssey.
Mm.
And I've been, still thinking about that question of how can I translate that within my constraints, and could I have done something different? What were my other options? And 6 or 7 years later, I still don't actually see what else I could have done. I think that was the only thing I could do that was a real English word that would fit the meter, that would allow me to use an actual word as opposed to a subordinate clause that's sort of spelling out all the different things it could mean, which is what many translators just use multiple different words. If I'm going to keep it line for line, and I want a single word that's not a made-up word, that connotes complexity and turningness, and can refer to the poem and the journey as well as the person, the character, I don't know what else I could have done.
Mm. I like complicated, for what
Yes.
it's worth.
Yeah.
Um, when I read your translation, and it had been a while since I'd read the Odyssey complete, I'd read bits of it, and the my previous reading of the whole thing actually was at university, and it was the Fitzgerald translation. And when I read yours, let me put it this way: when I read the Fitzgerald, it seemed to me misogynistic, and I don't just mean that there's gendered violence or that the world is, but the text itself somehow
Yes.
seemed misogynistic in ways that yours didn't.
Mhm.
And I know you've made specific choices in translation that differ from those of previous translators, and I wondered if you could talk about that, and maybe sort of, I think you might have a passage that you could discuss that
Yes,
particular.
absolutely. Yes. I mean, I have several passages I could potentially discuss, and maybe I'll just nod to a couple of others and then read one. It seems to me that the Odyssey has a lot to say about gender and is interesting about gender. I mean, interesting about gender in a way that's not simplistic or predictable, and that some of the translations, perhaps including Fitzgerald, sort of tend to present the female characters as othered in ways that are very predictable from a 20th century male American perspective, which doesn't necessarily map onto the specifics of misogyny or understandings of gender in archaic Greece or within this particular poem. I mean, for instance, in looking at different translations of Odysseus's now failing relationship with Calypso in book 5, I mean, I think Fitzgerald and several other translators sort of present Calypso as hysterical, nymphomaniac, she's operatic and crazy, and we couldn't possibly have any empathy for her. And we have huge empathy for this poor abused man who's in the clutches of the crazy nympho. And the language very much sort of underlines the idea idea that we're always looking through his perspective. And similarly, in book 22, when Odysseus tells his son Telemachus to hang the 12 women, the enslaved women who Odysseus has also said were raped by the suitors, Telemachus does that. And in a lot of translations that I've looked at, Telemachus presents it, and we're invited to look through the perspective of Telemachus, presents it as punishment for their sexual wrongness. And there's introduction of language like sluts, which is a word that Fitzgerald uses, where there's no gendered word in the Greek. So the Greek allows us to see what is it like for these women to be murdered, as well as what is it like for this young man who's struggling to attain his father's approval to try to get rid of the beings who've been claimed by other men. And then I guess passage I'm going to read is the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope. And I'm going to read it, and it's just within this context. It seems to me, and it's what I see in the Greek, and what I don't necessarily see in all translations, including Fitzgerald, is that both these characters we're shown how vulnerable they are, and we're shown what they're afraid of, and we get to understand them. Whereas I think some translations sort of sentimentalize it and present it as, look how lovely it is, he's got his wife back. And again, it's presenting it primarily through his perspective and sort of souping it up and making it Hallmark card in a way that sort of gets rid of the depths of rage and vulnerability and grief that I think are always there. And also the gap between her perspective and his perspective, which is there even when they're reuniting. So it's more heartbreaking if you realize the pain, if you understand the pain. So I was going to read that. Sorry, that was a bit too long, but I'm just going to read that passage. So this is from book 23, and Odysseus gets one of many lovely makeovers from Athena, who favors him. After his bath, he looked like an immortal. He sat down in the same chair opposite his wife and said, "Extraordinary woman, the gods have given you the hardest heart. No other wife would so reject a husband who has been suffering for 20 years and finally come home. Well, Nanny, make a bed for me so I can rest. This woman must have an iron heart." Penelope said shrewdly, "You extraordinary man! I am not acting proud or underplaying this big event, yet I am not surprised at how you look. You looked like this the day your long oars rowed away from Ithaca. Now, Eurycleia, make the bed for him outside the room he built himself. Pull out the bedstead and spread quilts and blankets on it." She spoke to test him, and Odysseus was furious and told his loyal wife, "Woman, your words have cut my heart. Who moved my bed? It would be difficult for even a master craftsman. Though a god could do it with ease, no man, however young and strong, could pry it out. There is a trick to how this bed was made. I made it, no one else. Inside the court, there grew an olive tree with delicate long leaves, full grown and green, as sturdy as a pillar, and I built the room around it. I packed stones together and fixed a roof and fitted doors. At last I trimmed the olive tree and used my bronze to cut the branches off from root to tip and planed it down and skillfully transformed the trunk into a bedpost. With a drill, I bored right through it. This was my first bedpost, and then I made the other 3, inlaid with gold and silver and with ivory. I stretched ox leather straps across, dyed purple. Now I have told the secret trick, the token. But, woman, wife, I do not know if someone, a man, has cut the olive trunk and moved my bed, or if it is still safe." At that, her heart and body suddenly relaxed. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face, and said, "Do not be angry at me now, Odysseus. In every other way, you are a very understanding man. The gods have made us suffer. They refused to let us stay together and enjoy our youth until we reach the edge of age together. Please, forgive me. Do not keep bearing a grudge, because when I first saw you, I would not welcome you immediately. I felt a constant dread that some bad man would fool me with his lies. There are so many dishonest, clever men. That foreigner would never have got Helen into bed if she had known the Greeks would march to war and bring her home again. It was a goddess who made her do it, putting in her heart the passion that first caused my grief as well. Now you have told the story of our bed, the secret that no other mortal knows, except yourself and me and just one slave, actress, who my father gave to me when I came here, who used to guard our room. You made my stubborn heart believe in you." This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers, when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds. A few escape to sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck.
Thank you. That was lovely. You're a fantastic reader, but I know that during COVID, you recorded yourself reading
I
bits.
did, yes. It was fun.
With some dressing up as well.
I did some dressing up, yes. I didn't bring my costume box today, but I used a little veil to be Penelope, because the veiling and the being behind a veil is so important to the poem. Yeah.
And of course, listening to it, of course, it takes us back to the idea of the oral storyteller, but also the music of it and the iambic pentameter really just shines through in that.
Good.
I wanted to go back a little, Emily, to what year was it that, if you can, I mean, I don't need a precise date, but around what year were you first approached to work on this, or did you start working on this translation?
I know I had a 5-year contract, and I think it came out in 2017. So I think it would have been probably 2011 kind of thing. I'm not sure, something like that. Yes.
The date strikes me because I realized as I was reading it, and so much of this story and your translation, I don't know whether your translation brought it out more or the moment brought it out more, but it's about people without a home, or people who've been through a war, landing up on these shores, and as you were in the process of writing it, I suppose the news headlines must have been increasingly filled with what was peculiarly called the European migrant crisis. But when when you heard the word Greece, it was to do with refugees.
Yes.
And
yes.
I wondered, just can you talk a little about that experience of working on this very, very ancient text and then these contemporary news stories kind of?
Yes, I mean, there's so much resonance, right? And yet it's also not exactly the same thing, but there is so much resonance. I mean, that what I just read of being the experience of being shipwrecked, the experience of desperately trying to cross the boundary of the sea, and some people don't survive that. Some people are drowned in those ships and drowned in very similar locations to where Odysseus is washed up on the shore. I was obviously aware of that. Obviously, I was aware of the global migration issues. I mean, obviously, also in non-maritime situations as well. I mean, I live primarily in Philadelphia, and the US migrant and immigration patterns are different. But I was aware of that. I mean, I wouldn't say it was sort of always at the forefront of my mind. I mean, I tend to, when I read the news, I'm a human being living in the world. I was conscious of it, but I wasn't sort of constantly trying to draw a direct line, because there were differences as well as similarities. But I do certainly think that sort of once the translation is out in the world and I'm talking about it, I'm even more, and when I teach the Iliad and the Odyssey, I'm aware that there are sort of surprising resonances with the crises about people being displaced that are there in these poems. There was a really great play version of my Odyssey translation by Lisa Peterson. I don't know if you heard of it, or so she adapted the translation to be a play that lasts about an hour and a half, and it's 4 women actors, and it's set in a contemporary migrant camp, and they're all coming from different parts of the world and reading the Odyssey together and sort of discussing that question of how does this poem resonate with our experiences of displacement in the modern world. And also, I like the play partly because it also includes these characters pushing back on it, and sometimes saying, actually, no, this doesn't speak to our experience, but then sometimes saying, yes, it does.
I mean, the lines that really struck me, there's one point where you have these lines: the worst things humans suffer is homelessness. We must endure this life because of desperate hunger. we endure as migrants with no home. And that really just, I remember in
Yes.
2017 how that struck me in the heart with everything
Absolutely. Yes.
that was going on.
Yes. And like so many moments of the Odyssey, there's this real complexity about the presentation of Odysseus as, on some level, the fake migrant, like the fake impoverished person, the fake beggar. He's not really a beggar. He's not really wandering impoverished, and he actually has a home to go to. I mean, the lines that come up in the context of Odysseus' encounter and dialogue with both Eumaeus, the real enslaved swineherd, and Odysseus claiming that his own experiences of displacement are far worse than those of Eumaeus. And then similarly, the encounter with Iris, the real beggar who doesn't have a home and has to beg, for his whole life, is actually homeless, as opposed to Odysseus, who's only, part-time homeless and pretend homeless.
And of course, you use the word slave, which not a lot of, I don't know if any previous translators did. There's often a kind of glossing over that aspect of it.
Yes, which I find kind of weird. I mean, to me, one of the most interesting features of both the Odyssey and the Iliad is the complexity of the representation of social relationships, including the very, very disempowered characters like the enslaved characters, and then the mortal characters, and then the divine characters who have so much more power than any human mortal could have. And it seemed to me really important to be clear about that, and that if you use words like handmaiden or maid or housekeeper, it's going to be very unclear. I mean, I've found that in just talking about these poems with my students, I would sort of ask, so what do we think about the representation of slavery in the Odyssey? And they would say, didn't even notice there was any, because it didn't come up, which I think is quite funny, but also quite sad. And it's a problem if you have missed something about the poem's world building.
Just sort of, when you said that you're talking the adaptation of your Odyssey into that hour-and-a-half play, I was reminded earlier today, as I was thinking what I was going to talk to you about, I took a break to look at the newspaper online, and Arifa Akbar, who's the Guardian's theatre critic, had her pick of theatre for the autumn, and among it was the fact that in October the Sherman Theatre in Cardiff is staging a play called Odyssey 84. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't. Oh, I have to see that.
It's a story of the miners' strike based on the Odyssey.
Wow.
Yeah. So
I mean, look that up. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's sort of fascinating that the sort of that certainly it's a story. It does come to us from far away in all kinds of ways, and yet there are so many elements in there that really do speak and are so adaptable to our purposes.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, both because wars are still happening and people are still coming home from wars, but also people are displaced for all kinds of reasons, for all kinds of violence, including things that aren't wars, but then the reintegration of the family unit or the community after these violent events is still part of what human beings are struggling with.
And of course, I mean, he is, I suppose, a war hero, and he is this great adventurer. It always strikes me as somehow just wonderful that the first time we actually see Odysseus, he is weeping.
He does a lot of crying. Yes.
There's a lot of crying. He's weeping. He's helpless. There's nothing he can do to get out of his situation. He really does require divine intervention. I mean, the Odyssey is very complex on the subject of masculinity, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Yes. And what does it mean to be masculine? I mean, even just the passage I just read, the way that Odysseus's anger is tied with Penelope, if she might have moved the bed, and anger against the possible other man who could have moved the supposedly immovable bed, his insistence on the first person singular, I built it, but then some other man could actually have got in there and messed with it. His claim on his own property, his own wife, his own marriage is dependent on what other men do and also on what she does. And so there's this way that being a man is this ideal of being an individual who can depend only on himself and his own powers of building things and fighting people and achieving honor. And yet it's also always represented as wrapped up with what other people and other deities can enable. And without those things, Odysseus is helpless. And how can he regain his household? How can he regain his sense of self and his honor? He can only do that with the help of Athena and Hermes.
And if we look at it through the lens of masculinity, there's an argument to be made for this being Telemachus' story, right? I mean, it begins with Telemachus, and if one of the ways in which we often talk about, admittedly, we talk about the novel this way more than the epic, but is a sort of character arc, and the character who really has the character arc,
yes,
Telemachus here, isn't it? And he's also, by the end, he both wants to be the man, but he very much wants to be the son who can say to his father, Dad, you tell me what to do and I'll go and do it.
Absolutely, yes. And he wants that right from the start, right? I mean, I think you're right that if there's a Bildungsroman in the Odyssey, it's Telemachus's, it's not Odysseus's. But of course, those are intertwined together, the story of the father and of the son, and how do they get back together? And then also the sort of three-part masculine journey of how does Laertes, the old man, get his son back? And the happy ending of the Odyssey, in a way, is not the scene I just read of the husband and wife reuniting, but the three-part masculine household fighting together. Once the three generations of Ithacans are able to kill their fellow islanders together, then Laertes can be happy and realize that his lineage is going to go on. That there's this sort of joy in seeing that not both Odysseus is home and back at being the master killer he's always been, and that Telemachus is also going to be able to be a man, which entails killing other men.
And of course, there is throughout, from a very early point in the Odyssey, there is this almost this sort of shadow story, which is Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, and Orestes. We hear about them a lot, and it's almost as though, this is what can happen to Odysseus, Penelope, and Telemachus. This is what can happen when the man who's been to war comes home if his wife has not been faithful. And I mean, I find it so fascinating the way that operates within the Odyssey. I wonder if you could talk about that a little.
Yes, I mean that you're absolutely right. That's woven through, and people sometimes say that the Odyssey, that this is a period of literature before the subplot, but in a way that story operates as the subplot or the counterplot. Penelope and Clytemnestra are cousins and are repeatedly presented as sort of counterparts, that Agamemnon has had the kind of nostos or homecoming journey that no Greek warrior would want, where he comes home and his wife has shacked up with a suitor and he gets slaughtered. And the only hope, therefore, is for the son character, Orestes, in this case, to act as the avenger. So that's also tied up to the Telemachus plot. The pressure that the gods, especially Athena, are putting on Telemachus is partly through repeatedly telling him that story, warning him that his mother, Penelope, could turn out to be a Clytemnestra figure, so he has to be tough enough to be an Orestes figure, even if the actual bad story with Penelope and the suitors hasn't quite happened yet. They have to preemptively kill off the Aegisthus characters, kill off the suitors, before it all turns into an Agamemnon Clytemnestra story.
I mean, and in that way, it does hinge on Penelope, doesn't it?
It hinges on Penelope, and yet she's given no information to make good decisions, right? So it hinges on her, and yet there's all this opacity, both about what she thinks and feels and what information she has access to, because we're told repeatedly that Athena is blocking her mind or veiling her mind, so that she's unable to see clearly who this stranger who's come to visit her, with whom she has this special connection and can talk, unlike any other of these ragged characters who keep showing up at her palace and asking for handouts. She has a special connection with this one, and yet she doesn't explicitly recognize who he is.
Do you think she recognizes who he is?
I think I don't think she does in a sort of conscious way, but maybe conscious and unconscious aren't quite the right terms, because of course it's anachronistic. But I think she feels close to him. But I think we're told very explicitly that she doesn't know. But there can be places of consciousness between knowing and not knowing. But I think there's also even more interesting than that. I mean, I think that's very interesting. People have different views about that. I think there's also really interesting ambiguities about, does she even want him to come back? Insofar as we have that wonderful passage in which she tells the beggar, who's actually her husband, about her dream about the geese coming in, and the eagle comes down and kills the geese. And in the dream, she's crying. And the eagle explains, he's Odysseus, he's come to kill off the suitors, happy ending, it's all great. But we're not told, why is she crying? She misses the geese. Maybe she's having a good time with the suitors. Maybe there's a way that when Odysseus comes back, she doesn't have the level of agency or attention that she has as the queen, who doesn't have a king.
It's, you can't say that the Odyssey is about one thing. It's about many things. I think what you can say is it is very, very interested in storytelling. Yes. And it's quite, I don't know if democratic is the right word to use about it, but everyone, it doesn't matter if you're a swineherd or a king. You get to tell your story, and your story, you're given as, you're as interesting as your story is. And it's, one of the really sort of amusing things to me about it, it has a lot of amusement in it, but is the fact that the person who tells the tall tales more than anyone else is Odysseus, who has so many different versions of who he is to different people. And we know that most of them are absolute lies.
Yes.
And in the middle of it, there's this central story, which we think of as the Odyssey, which is, me and the Cyclops and me and Circe. Yes. And we don't really know, do we? He is the ultimate unreliable narrator. We don't really know what is true or what is not. And the only way we can really gauge anything is by what we're told of his emotions.
Yes, we get to know quite a lot about his emotions. In the passage I just read, we hear a lot about his anger, and of course in Homer, anger is always tied up with grief and with fear. Within the tall tales that he tells about how he spent time on the magical land of the Phaeacians, and it's within that sort of very nested narrative within narrative that we get Odysseus is the storyteller, but he tells stories about stories, such that the poet in the land of the Phaeacians sings 3 different songs in Book 8 of the Odyssey, each of which tells us something, I think, quite complicated about Odysseus's emotions and whatever is the truth, including that Odysseus listens to the story of the adulterous love affair of Ares and Aphrodite and is really happy about it, which you might think he wouldn't like that, because the whole premise of the Odyssey is supposed to be that it's not necessarily a great thing to be in the position of Hephaestus and come home and realize that your wife's in bed with someone else. You might think Odysseus would find that a scary story, but he loves it. And then we get the inset story about the wooden horse, Odysseus's own greatest triumph. He's explicitly asked the poet to tell that story. When the poet does tell that story, Odysseus bursts into tears, and the narrator tells us that his weeping is like the weeping of a woman who's watching her husband be killed, and she's being taken into slavery. So we're told a really complicated truth about where Odysseus is emotionally in his journey.
It is such an interesting way of storytelling, is that the actual stories we're being told, we don't know
yes.
Are they true or not, and yet the emotional truths of Odysseus keep coming out, and we know him through them rather than through the stories about him.
Yes, and we know something about his fantasies too. If we sort of think all his false autobiographies, he keeps saying he comes from Crete. He keeps making up different stories about what exactly is his background when he's presenting himself in different ways. But there were also through lines about what kinds of achievement does he claim to have done.
I'm going to move over because I know there've been some audience questions that have come in, which I want to give some space to. So let's go with this one. This is from Laura. What's your take on Odysseus? Is he a flawed, narcissistic, polyamorous twit, or a real hero? And do you think Penelope really does get her happily ever after?
I don't think I quite buy that those are the only options. I mean, I think the idea of, we have an idea of the quote unquote hero as a entirely positive kind of character with no flaws, about to save Gotham City kind of thing. That's not what a hero or heros means within Greek culture. It means somebody who's somehow a character who's larger than life and maybe in some way godlike in what they can achieve. As Odysseus's homecoming story is, it's an extraordinary story, and he's an extraordinary character. I wouldn't say he's a twit. I think the poem gives us, the tools to have something that's not at all a dismissive account of him. We get, as we've just been discussing, we get in very deep into the complexity of his emotions. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to be married to him, but does that mean that the poem doesn't allow us to have deep understanding and empathy for him? It absolutely does. I mean, I feel I can absolutely understand him and understand what is it like to be him. I'm not sure if that really answers it. I didn't really answer the question about Penelope. I mean, what we see Penelope expressing repeatedly is how much grief she's experienced over the last 20 years and how her face is marked by how many tears she's shed. And in that scene that I just read, where she emphasizes that her husband has come back, she also emphasizes that he's come back looking exactly the same as when he abandoned her the first time. And we also know that within ancient myth, there are many, many stories about Odysseus then coming back to Ithaca and leaving again, whether it's to seek the place where nobody knows what an oar is, or for these various other reasons, being driven into exile by the fathers of all those whom he's killed. Do we think Odysseus is going to stick around at the end of the Odyssey? I think that's pretty ambiguous. But I think there's also ambiguity about, is Penelope going to be better off with him or without him? That's also ambiguous.
Did working on the translation do anything to shift your notions of any of the characters? Because I mean, you'd obviously read and reread it.
I'd read and reread it for decades, and I'd taught it a lot of times. So I already sort of had a view about, most scenes, most passages, most characters. I mean, I think the more I worked on it, the more I realized Homer doesn't actually nod as much as you might think. I mean, you might think some passages in this poem are less interesting to me than others. I mean, I think before I did the translation, I hadn't actually had nearly as much appreciation as I later did of book 3 with the focus on Nestor. I sort of had the kind of cliche idea of, here's this this old man who goes wittering on about the past and his speeches are too long. And I get that they're supposed to be too long, but they also are too long, and it's kind of boring. And then once I spent the amount of time I had to really think through how is the text presenting Nestor, I changed my mind. I think it's actually great. I love book 3. And I just had a new level of appreciation, even for the bits that I'd thought were less interesting.
Thomas asks, you've just published your brilliant translation of the Iliad. How did the two experiences translating these compare?
Well, we already talked a little bit about the technical thing of with the Odyssey. I did it line for line, and so I was constantly coming up with what I thought was a great draft of a book of the poem, and then I would realize, oh no, I've got too many lines. I need to go back and get rid of some syllables somehow. So I need to just do some kind of some of my 3-syllable words need to become monosyllables, and I need to move things around. With the Iliad, I spent months trying to do that. Once I'd got over that and realized I'm just going to let myself use more lines, I think it was actually better. I felt that I actually had, the constraint was slightly too tight with the line constraint. And I was able to be a tiny bit more expansive in some places where I felt I really needed it. I had thought that it would be easy to go from the Odyssey to the Iliad because I was already so much immersed in that poetic world, and then within that, the ideas that I'd already had about how to approach it. And so I was surprised to realize how difficult it was, and how I felt I absolutely did have to start all over again, and that I had to sort of reimagine what I was doing and rethink everything. I mean, the Iliad is so much more intense, and just in terms of the noise and the emotional, the amount of fury, and the question of how to make sure that all the scenes of men screaming and yelling at each other don't come across as comic or melodramatic, and yet do sound as intense as they need to be. That was a different kind of writing challenge from most of the Odyssey.
Fred asks, if you were to write a novel reimagining the life of a Greek character, who would it be?
Oh, so I mean, obviously we're in the presence of somebody who's done that. I'm actually I find that a difficult question to answer. So I'm actually doing a cop-out thing of doing a fictional retelling of the myths in the background of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it's linked short stories. So each of them is focused on a different character. So I'm doing about 30 different characters because I couldn't decide the answer to that question.
Oh, well, what a productive question that was.
Yes.
Is this sort of, can we ask when this might appear in our midst?
I've written about a third of it, so it depends how fast I am with the rest of it. Yeah.
Okay, well, that answers Vero's question, which is, what are you working on now?
I'm working on that. I'm also working on a translation of Ovid's Heroides, which is also fun.
Right.
So that it's Latin.
And you're also teaching and chairing a department. So
exactly, yes.
Making the rest of us look very bad. I'm going to stop this line of inquiry now.
Yes.
What are the toughest challenges of working with classical texts, asks Lydia, and were there any particularly hard choices you had to make for this translation?
I mean, I've worked on classical texts all my career, so it's hard to sort of sum up the one thing that was hard. I mean, so many things are hard, and hard is part of why it's interesting. I mean, I felt that the question of just how to make sure that the verse sounds both artful and natural, and that the characters, the characters' emotions are legible without hamming it up. I mean, I think we sort of talked about this a little bit already in our conversation of the ways that it seems to me that some translators don't quite trust the process enough to realize it's going to be audible or legible to the reader. How does Penelope feel here? How does Odysseus feel here? I don't have to add things in to make that clear. I just have to really lean into what is already there. But then also recognizing that if I'm conveying the alien features of the original, like why are they killing all these oxen, and why are the gods suddenly appearing among the humans, and these strange social practices, and also strange ways of imagining emotions in the body? Are there ways I can convey both the familiar and the alien about Homer? That's something I wrestle with all the time.
And one other question from Ruth. To what extent did you use other translations, and do you find it helpful to do that? You mentioned that when you were thinking about whether or not to take this on, you sort of looked at some translations. So I wonder if you could talk a little about your relationship to the other translations.
Yeah, I don't look at the others while I'm actually working on it. I mean, with both the Iliad and the Odyssey, I had to do a book proposal. As with any book, you have to demonstrate to the publishers that you're doing something, that you're proposing to do something worthwhile, and that it's not going to be completely reinventing the wheel. So in order to convince both myself and the editors at Norton that there was a place for a new translation of the Odyssey and then of the Iliad, I did that close, looking at multiple translations, thinking through what would I do differently, what kinds of things am I prioritizing that might be different from what Fitzgerald or Fagles or Lattimore might have prioritized. But then once I'd done that and done a little sample and a proposal outlining what I think I would do differently, I then put the other translations away for the next 5 years. As it didn't ever seem to me that if I'm struggling with how can I say this in English, can I convey this alien idiom, do I have to translate this idiom by a different idiom, those kinds of challenges of translation, if I then go and look and see what Richmond Lattimore did, then I've just spoiled one of my possible options, and that's no use. So it didn't ever feel to me that it was going to be useful to do a comparison of multiple translations while I'm trying to produce my own. Now that once I'd finished my own, I then go back sometimes, and because of course people want to know how is yours different. So I've done lots of talks, and so in the course of doing that, I very often have a few passages with my translation of a particular bit next to some others. And I always learned something by doing that. And I very often see things that I didn't consciously realize I was prioritizing. I always do a lot of reading the commentaries, reading dictionaries, looking things up and trying to figure out where else is this word used and what might the connotations be. Because of course, in lieu of having living speakers of Homeric Greek that I can ask about that, I need to check in with the commentaries, check in with the scholarly tradition about Homer and read books about Homer in order to figure those kinds of things out. But I didn't think the translations were going to help me about that. The one exception, with the Iliad much more than the Odyssey, because as I said already, there were far more names. I would sometimes, especially in book 2 with the catalogue of ships, I would sometimes get stuck on where's the natural place for an English speaker to put the emphasis for this name. And then I would think, well, maybe I can go and look at how does Pope do this passage? And then I'll be able to figure out this is how he dealt with that name. And that was, I did that several times when I was working on book 2 of the Iliad, and it was always completely useless. Because it would always be the case that 18th century pronunciation is not actually the same as the norms of 21st century pronunciation. Pope very often adds in different things that aren't in the Greek to try to make the scansion work or to just jazz it up a bit. And his way of anglicizing the names is very different from what would be natural in the 21st century. So it was useless. I did it several times, but it didn't help me.
Because of the ways in which English is not a global language, it's a sort of multi-nation language. Your translation will have been read and discussed and reviewed in many different parts of the world. I wonder whether you've had different responses or been struck by anything about that sort of global spread of readers you have.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I worked with both Homer translations. I worked pretty closely with an American editor, and he would very often, when I thought I had a good draft, he would catch a Britishism, and I would then rewrite the whole passage to try to get rid of it, because I don't want it to be. I mean, I've also met a lot of people who have been surprised that I'm British, which I want people to be surprised. I don't want it to be obvious from the translation that it's very much a British person's translation. So I want it to, if possible, to be. But it's difficult because there isn't actually a completely dialect neutral version of English. I mean, there isn't a place in the mid-Atlantic that I can locate whatever it is. If the idiom might seem markedly American or British or Australian, then I don't necessarily want it. But then I also don't want the language to seem so neutral that it's completely sapped of any energy. And that's a very difficult balance. I mean, I guess one thing that a couple of examples that I was surprised that reviewers picked up on. One was the word scallywag, which the American publishers insisted had to be spelled scalawag, which I would never have written. I was surprised by that. I almost got rid of the word because I thought that's not the word I meant scallywag. But I ended up keeping it because I think it's a fun and colorful word, and it's a word that is colorful in the Greek. So I think if there's something inventive going on linguistically in the original, then I want it to be marked or interesting in the translation. And then another one that I think millions, well, not millions, at least 3 reviewers picked up on my use of the word tote bag, which I thought, as a British person, I thought I would never carry food in a satchel. And I need a word that's a specific kind of bag, because the Greek word is a specific kind of bag. It's not just a random bag. It's the bag that Odysseus is carrying around as a beggar to put the scraps of food in. I can't use a shopping bag or a grocery bag because he's not going to the supermarket to get food. He's gathering food into the bag. So many American readers thought that I was feminizing Odysseus by giving him a tote bag that I ended up changing it for the later editions because that wasn't actually what I meant to be doing. I just thought I need a specific kind of bag word. So anyway, but I think that's a dialect issue.
I now like the idea of Odysseus wandering around with a hay festival tote bag.
Yes, that would be good. Yes,
that's the right one.
That would look good. Yes.
Emily, thank you so much for giving us your time. And I know it's the first week of the semester where you are, so it's particularly appreciated. And to all of you who are watching live in your various parts of the world, thank you for watching. Those of you who will watch it later, thank you for watching also. And goodbye from me, and goodbye from Emily.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.